Our first panelist is Mr. Daniel Pila. Is it Pila or Pilla? Daniel Pilla, and he is a tax litigation specialist in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He has just published a study for us at the Cato Institute called Why You Can't Trust the IRS. He is also the author of about 5 books that are self-help books on taxation. His latest we like quite a bit. It's called How to Fire the IRS, and he will talk about his new study.
I want to thank the Cato Institute and specifically Steve for bringing me here to Washington to talk about this and for allowing me the opportunity to conduct this study. A couple of things I want to talk about first. When Steve invited me to come, I very enthusiastically put together about a 4-hour presentation on why we need to trash the IRS and the income tax system, and complete with 316 graphs and charts. And then he told me I have 10 minutes, so I've narrowed it down. To the most fundamental points, and so there's 87 ideas here that I want to run through with you here very quickly. These are just the basic reasons why we need to get rid of the IRS. First of all, let me give you 37 seconds about my background, who I am, and what it is I do. As a tax litigation consultant, I worked with thousands of individuals, attorneys, and accountants over the years, over the last 19 years, in the area of IRS abuse prevention and cure, problems resolution, and taxpayers' rights issues. I deal specifically with the people in the trenches who have problems with the Internal Revenue Service. I deal quite literally with thousands of people every year, hundreds of people every week who are having problems with the Internal Revenue Service. I've seen every kind of IRS abuse perpetrated on the American public that you can imagine, and I've seen a number of things that you can't imagine. And so I think I am uniquely qualified as anybody in this room to talk about the reasons why we need to trash the IRS. And I would dare say I'm more qualified than perhaps anybody in this town to talk about why we need to trash the Internal Revenue Service and the current income tax system altogether. The premise of the report that I produced for the Cato Institute is the concept of how efficient, how accurate the Internal Revenue Service is in connection with its administration of the tax laws. Let's start with the premise, folks, that we have a tax law today that consists of 17,000 pages of law and regulation that was changed more than 100 times just during the decade of the 1980s alone. We're talking about minor changes and major changes. In halfway through the decade of the 1990s, we are on track to duplicate that performance, folks. And so if there's any question in anybody's mind why you can't figure out what the tax law says, then all you need to do is look at the history of the changes. The pot has been stirred so many times we can't tell the difference between carrots and peas and meat anymore. So now the question is, with that background, what is the IRS doing and how are they doing it? And the report that Cato has produced, that I wrote for Cato, talks about 6 or 7 major areas of tax law administration and how the IRS performs in this environment. Never mind how the citizens perform in this environment, because let's start with the premise that we would think the agency that administers the tax law would have a little idea of what the law says. The conclusion of the report, however, is something quite different. It seems that folks, they have no clue, they have no idea what the 17,000 pages of law and regulation says or how it's to be interpreted, and the result of that is we have arbitrary and capricious interpretation activities and arbitrary and capricious enforcement, which cost the American people billions of dollars every year. Let me give you some examples. First and foremost, the IRS will mail in 1995 about 100 million notices and letters and other types of correspondence to the American people concerning one issue or another. About 40 million of those notices will be penalty notices, correction notices, some kind of demand notices, and the conclusion of the study is, with respect to those notices, folks, they're wrong half the time. They're wrong half the time. When the IRS sends you a letter that says, "Dear taxpayer, you made a mistake on your tax return, but don't worry, we fixed it. Now you owe us $750, so just send in your check," those notices are wrong half the time. And these notices cover mistakes on the tax return, and they cover allegations of non-filing. And this is a critical element, because we are discussing here this morning whether we should go to a flat tax system and require not one tax return, not one, but 13 tax returns. All right? Let's put this in perspective. Right now in 1995, there will be 115 million, roughly, more or less, individual income tax returns filed. If we can take the Army plan at its face value and conclude that 10 million people will be dropped off those rolls, we'll still be talking about roughly 100 to 105 million tax returns. Times that by 13, and that's the kind of administrative problem the IRS is going to be faced with, and they can't get it right now. Okay, that's the good news. Now, the bad news, folks, is that when we go through the Internal Revenue Service audits, when the IRS sits down across the table from the average taxpayer and says, okay, dear taxpayer, let's look at your tax returns, and one of these hotshot know-it-all tax auditors rummages through your records and makes the decision that you owe additional taxes, they are wrong with those results half the time. And yet, by using tactics of bluff and intimidation, misinformation and disinformation, and in many cases outright lies to the American people, they end up assessing additional tax and penalty on the average of $5,000 per tax audit. Now, when you factor in interest on top of that, it doubles the liability. And so the average citizen who believes he's done everything properly, everything correctly, has kept what he believes to be good records, and has dotted the I's he thought he saw along the way, the IRS says, no, that's not good enough. You owe us an additional 10 grand. Now, it goes on from there, ladies and gentlemen. You would think that an agency whose primary responsibility is to police the activities of 115 million people in record keeping would have some clue, some proposition, or some idea on how to keep records itself. I mean, it would just be a natural conclusion. And so that's a question I asked in connection with the report. Can the IRS count? And the answer, surprisingly, is it doesn't seem that the agency can count, ladies and gentlemen. Just for example, in 1992, General Accounting Office produced a report of the 1992 IRS financial statements. And the conclusion, among other horrendous conclusions, was that the Internal Revenue Service, ladies and gentlemen, could not account for 64% of its $6.9 billion 1992 appropriation. Now, you know, in my Midwestern naivete, it seems like to me that these folks just don't have a grasp of what's going on. And so we've got to come to the conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, that any change in our tax system must necessarily trash the Internal Revenue Service. We've got to get rid of the Internal Revenue Service. This agency is absolutely incapable of administering the tax law now. This agency is absolutely incapable of administering the tax returns that it's faced with. And the tax returns is the smallest part of the problem, folks. When you combine business and individual tax returns, we're talking about roughly 205 million tax returns. That's a small part of the puzzle. The biggest part of the puzzle is the information return blizzard that is required by businesses and individuals in this country. We're talking about 1.2 to 1.3 billion information returns, forms W-2 and 1099 filed in this country every year, and I will make this prediction and you write it down. If we go to a flat tax system in this country where we're taxing strictly income and deductions have nothing to do with the equation, the number of information returns required by the IRS will double, probably triple. We are talking about a tremendous explosion of paperwork to allow the Internal Revenue Service to follow you around, follow every aspect of your life. And don't say it can't happen, folks, because it's happening right now. As a matter of fact, since 1986, we have seen a phase-out of the deductions. There are fewer and fewer deductions available for individuals. More and more people are filing the short form, which is effectively a flat tax return. And despite that fact, ladies and gentlemen, the IRS found a way to audit 30% of the short forms filed in 1992, assessing additional tax and penalties against individuals claiming gross income under $25,000. The IRS audited 30% of those returns and assessed $2,500 in additional tax and penalties per return. Make no mistake about it, ladies and gentlemen, for a dozen reasons that I don't have time to go into right now. Steve is panicking here. For a dozen reasons, we need to trash the Internal Revenue Service. We need to bulldoze the income tax system entirely, lock, stock, and barrel. And we need to adopt a plan that allows the government to collect the revenue it needs to fund its legitimate functions without invading every aspect of the privacy of the American citizens. Very, very quick time. Okay, that's reason number one. Now I got 86 more.
We'll have you back next year. Our next speaker is